Joining us, Walter Isaacson, the CEO of the Aspen Institute and author of the biography, Steve Jobs. Walter, welcome. A real firestorm. It's top of the charts, it's selling like hotcakes, it's causing huge debate, and you'd expect all that because Steve Jobs is one of the great American business icons in history. It's a fascinating book. I mean, I plucked out some of the adjectives you use to describe him: petulant, obnoxious, rude, selfish, nasty, ruthless. And I'm not surprised. Nothing that I know about Steve Jobs surprises me that he would be all those things. I would add, and I'm sure you would, brilliant, mercurial, genius. You know, a genius.
Absolutely.
Can you be a genius without being all these things?
You know, I used to work at this network, and I worked for Ted Turner, and I think every one of those adjectives applied to him, but he was able to create something totally new. And with Steve, every person I talked to, especially those who loved him the most, who worked with him closest, they'd always tell you their Steve story about the time he bit their head off. But I try really hard in the book to make sure everybody understands that that was, you know, if you're wearing velvet gloves, it's hard to make a dent in the universe. He actually got people to do things that they never thought they could do just by inspiring them and sometimes berating them. But I think people understood it of him.
He came to you a number of years ago.
Yeah.
Some thought at the time very arrogantly and said, you know, you've done Einstein, you've done Franklin, you've done Kissinger, I want you to do my book. And, you know, I guess your natural reaction, because you didn't know that he was sick with cancer, although he did, would have been, well, a bit presumptuous maybe, you know, you're not even in your 40s yet or whatever.
Yeah.
What was your reaction when he first came to you?
Well, you're right, precisely that. You know, I said, hey, you know, you're my age, you know, in 20 years, 30 years or so, I'd love to do a biography. You know, he was in an up and down career, and it wasn't really until 2009 that I figured out, and his wife told me, okay, you ought to do it now. And that's when he had just had his liver transplant. And of course, being Steve, the minute I said, yes, I'd really love to do it, I think he had trepidations and second thoughts. So we spent a lot of 2009 going back and forth.
But a fascinating time to sit down with him, with a man who probably knew he was dying. This is a man who has got very bad pancreatic cancer. He's trying a few things. Interesting in the book where you say he tried too many alternative treatments and probably could have saved himself if he hadn't done that, but typical of the man, I would guess.
Yeah. I'm not sure he would have saved himself, and very typical of the man. There are two sides of Steve Jobs, sort of this rebel, counterculture, child of the, you know, the hippie period, and he's always trying alternative new things, but also the scientific, technological geek. So he's doing the most advanced forms of medicine, and he's studying both of these as he decides how to treat himself. I think that, you know, he never really thought, I don't think, that the cancer was going to catch him. Up until almost the end, he thought he was going to stay, as he put it, one lily pad ahead of the cancer, because he was doing targeted therapy based on gene sequencing, and every time the cancer would mutate, he'd find a new bullet or a new way to stop it. So, you know, even though he was facing his mortality, even though even before he had cancer, he used to talk about life being an arc, you're born and you die. I think that that magical, optimistic thinking he had, up until the end, he thought he was going to beat the cancer.
You had a remarkable amount of time with him, over 40 interviews that you did with Steve Jobs, which is probably more time than anybody's had, I would imagine, with that brain outside of his immediate family and closest friends. The obvious question to me when I finished the book was, did you like him?
I did. In fact,
was he likable?
He was compelling and likable, because when you first meet him, you're afraid, okay, you've heard all the tales, and I saw it every now and then. I'd be walking around with him, whether it was in a restaurant or in a hotel or in a group of people. He would, if somebody said something stupid, instead of saying, I'm not sure I agree with you, he'd say, that's the stupidest blank, blank, blank idea I have ever heard. And you'd be a little taken aback.
But you saw him do that, and this is where I have a problem with the way that he was. I've always thought you can judge people in two camps: those who are polite to waitresses and those who are rude to waitresses. And I think you tell a story of how you've seen him be rude to waitresses, and I'm like, a man of his power and his wealth to be rude to a waitress serving a table, to me, hard to like that kind of person. Admire and you know, and salute him and all the rest of it, but likable.
Well, you know, there's certain types of behavior you don't like, but after a while, you talk to him about it, he said, you know, that woman didn't want to be doing that job in that way or whatever, and he just rationalizes it. I think that if you want to judge everybody by their politeness, you'd find a whole bunch of nice, clubbable friends. You probably wouldn't find a whole lot of geniuses in the mix.
Was he driven essentially by perfectionism? Is that what it was all about?
I think he had an artistic sensibility, and just like a Picasso or a Bob Dylan or whatever it may be, driven by the power of perfection and almost a poetic sensibility. As I said a moment ago, there's that sort of emotional, sentimental, romantic side of him, and there's a down-to-earth, hardcore business side of him. And I think he was driven by connecting the two. Whatever he did, even when it came to, you know, being tough on the people around him, that instilled such a loyalty and a passion that, you know, it was a bonding thing. He said, that's the price of admission for being in the room, which is, I get to say you're full of it, you get to say I'm full of it, and we create the best team there is.
I get that. I mean, I've worked for Rupert Murdoch. I've worked for
people
like
bosses.
that. And when you work for these people, yes, they're all those adjectives that I read out earlier about Steve Jobs, but they're also automatically charismatic because of who they are, and often very inspiring because they tend to work harder than anybody else. They're driven, they're creative, they take risks, they're gamblers. They're all the things that most people would like to be, but actually tend not to be in their life.
And you just described Steve Jobs, I mean, perfectly. He's a risk taker, a gambler, charismatic, compelling, and
control freak. I mean, didn't he even choose his own cover?
I got chewed out. I mean, the one time I really got chewed out is because he said, I'm going to have no control over this book. I'm not going to read it. He said, I don't want it to feel like an in-house book. I don't want it to, you know, you're going to put things in there I'm not going to like, but that's good because it's not going to feel like some commissioned in-house book. But then there was a cover design that my publisher put out in the catalog. He looked at it and he said in very short, snippy words that it was the worst thing he had ever seen. And it, you know, and he had some merit to it. And after yelling at me for a while, I'm holding the phone like this, he says, I'm not going to keep cooperating unless you allow me to have some input into the cover. Now, I thought for maybe 1 second or 1.5 seconds, I said, sure. I mean, a guy with a great design eye, but I saw that sort of artistic passion.
I mean, it's a very clean Apple-style cover.
I know.
If you were designing a book cover for the boss of Apple, it would be that. Lots of white,
I will not show you the one we designed before then because it just shows how bad we were.
And he was right, you think?
You just said so.
Yeah. I mean, I like that cover. Yeah. To me, it instantly grabs you. It's like one of his products.
It's just like an Apple product.
It's simple, it's clean, but it's fascinating.
You know Johnny Ive, probably. Yeah, and a wonderful guy from, you know, Britain. And he says that the drive towards simplicity means that you really have to understand the depths of something. You can't just remove a lot of buttons and then it becomes simple. And that was the essence of the Johnny Ive, Steve Jobs design sensibility.
Just reading the book, it doesn't sound like he was the world's best engineer. It sounds to me, I've always thought about Steve Jobs, that, and I felt this strongly when he died and all the plaudits were coming in as this great, you know, engineer and so on. I thought, well, actually, his genius, it seemed to me, partly was marketing. This was one of the great marketeers I've ever seen. And but cynical and ruthless in the sense that, you know, when I saw these first models come out of all his products, you knew he deliberately left a few things off that everyone would want, but wouldn't desperately need immediately, but they would all, the moment he put them on the next version of that model, they'd all rush out and buy that too. And that is brilliant marketing, but it's manipulative, it's cynical.
You know, you had Woz on the show a couple nights ago.
He's the engineering genius.
And as Steve said, he's 50 times better than any engineer that Steve has ever met, Steve Jobs has ever met. He said Woz could do meetings in his head. So they're young kids, and they're, you know, Steve is, Wozniak has created a blue box that allows you to rip off the phone company by making long-distance calls. And they're giving it away, and it's Steve Jobs who says, no, I can put a case around it, and we can market it. Likewise, when Woz comes up with the circuit board that becomes the Apple I circuit board, you know, it is a brilliant design, you know, using the microprocessors and really juicing them up to do great things. But it's Jobs who says, all right, we're going to get a case for it, we're going to get the power supply.
It's not a brilliant design, it's a brilliant piece of engineering.
Correct, that's it. I'm sorry.
What Jobs brings, it's Lennon and McCartney, isn't it? It's like all these great double acts where either, if you have one or the other, they would never be as great as the
when you say Lennon and McCartney, do you mind me? There's a part in the book I love, and part of a moment I had with Steve in his living room, where they're listening to the bootleg tapes he had of Strawberry Fields being created. And John Lennon is doing it, and McCartney's riffing on it with him. I don't know if you've ever heard these. There's like 15 different takes they do. And they'd hit a wrong chord, and they'd rewind. And Steve would say, that's exactly like I love doing at Apple, and with Woz, and with the people who are always fighting, which is we almost have it done, and then we rewind and make it more perfect. So I think Woz and Steve were that way, Johnny Ive and Steve were that way, Lennon and McCartney were that way.